It's beneficial. It's been shown in scientific studies that if you take a 20-minute shallow nap or you simply do nothing after a period of learning, that it enhances the rates of learning and the depth of learning, your ability to learn and remember that information. What I'm about to describe are new data that say that you actually should be injecting rest within the learning episode. Now, I'm not talking about going to sleep while learning. This is the way that the study was done. The study involved having people learn sequences of numbers or keys on a piano. So let's use the keys on a piano example. I'm not a musician, but I think I'll get this correct. They asked people to practice a sequence of keys. G, D, F, E, G. G, D, F, E, G. G, D, F, E, G. And they would practice that either continually for a given amount of time, or they would just do that for 10 seconds. They would play G, D, F, E, G, G, D, F, E, G, G, D, F, E, G, G, D, F, E, G for 10 seconds. And then they would take a 10-second pause, a rest. They would just take a space or a period of time where they do nothing for 10 seconds. Then they would go back to G, D, F, E, G, G, D, F, E, G. So the two conditions essentially were to have people practice continually, lots of repetitions, or to inject or insert these periods of 10 seconds idle time where they're not doing anything, they're not looking at their phone, they're not focusing on anything, they're just letting their mind drift wherever it wants to go, and they are not touching the keys on the keyboard. What they found was that the rates of learning, the skill acquisition, and the retention of the skill was significantly faster when they injected these short periods of rest, these 10-second rest periods. And the rates of learning were, when I say significantly faster, were much, much faster. I'll reveal what that was in just a moment. But you might ask, why would this work? Why would it be that injecting these 10-second rest periods would enhance rates of learning? What they called them was micro offline gains, because they're sort of taking their brain offline from the learning task for a moment. Well, it turns out the brain isn't going offline at all. Probably heard of the hippocampus, the area of the brain involved in memory, and the neocortex, the area of the brain that's involved in processing sensory information. Well, it turns out that during these brief periods of rest, these 10-second rest periods, the hippocampus and the cortex are active in ways such that you get a 20 times repeat of the GDFEG. It's a temporal compression, as they say. So basically the rehearsal continues while you rest, but at 20 times the speed. So if you were normally getting just, let's just say, 5 repetitions of GDFEG, GDFEG, GDFEG per 10 seconds, now you multiply that times 20. In the rest periods, you've practiced it 100 times. Your brain has practiced it. We know this because they were doing brain imaging, functional imaging of these people with brain scanners while they were doing this. This is an absolutely staggering effect. And it's one that, believe it or not, has been hypothesized or thought to exist for a very long time. This effect is called the spacing effect, and it was actually first proposed by Ebbington in 1885. And since then, it's been demonstrated for a huge number of different what they call domains, in the cognitive domain, so for learning languages, for in the physical domain, so for learning skills that involve a motor sequence. It's been demonstrated for a huge number of different categories of learning. If you want to learn all about the spacing effect and the categories of learning that it can impact, there's a wonderful review article. I'll provide a link to it. The title of the review article is Parallels Between Spacing Effects During Behavioral and Cellular Learning. What that review really does is it ties the behavioral learning and the improvement of skill to the underlying changes in neurons that can explain that learning. I should mention that the paper that I'm referring to, the more recent paper that injects these 10-second little micro offline gains rest periods, is the work of the laboratory of Leonard Cohen. Not the musician Leonard Cohen. He passed away. He was not a neuroscientist, a wonderful poet and musician, but not a neuroscientist. Again, the paper was published in Cell Reports, and we will provide a link to the full paper as well. So the takeaway is, if you're trying to learn something, you need to get those reps in, but one way that you can get 20 times the number of reps in is by injecting these little 10-second periods of doing nothing. Again, during those rest periods, you really don't want to attend to anything else as much as possible. You could close your eyes if you want, or you can just simply wait and then get right back into generating repetitions. I find these papers that Cell Reports and other journals have been publishing recently to be fascinating because they're really helping us understand what are the best protocols for learning anything. And they really leverage the fact that the brain is willing to generate repetitions for us, provided that we give it the rest that it needs. So inject rest throughout the learning period and If you can, based on the scientific data, you would also want to take a 20-minute nap or a 20-minute decompress period where you're not doing anything after a period of learning. I think those could both synergize in order to enhance learning even further, although that hasn't been looked at yet. What I call limbic friction is really designed to describe the fact that when our autonomic nervous system isn't where we want it, meaning we're trying to be more alert or we're trying to be less alert, both of those feel stressful to people. So the other way to put it is that the word stress is not a very good word to describe what most people experience as stressful, because it can either be being too tired or being too alert. Now, why am I bringing this up in a discussion about neuroplasticity? This is not a discussion about stress. At some point, we will talk about stress and tools to deal with stress. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that in order to access neuroplasticity, you need these components of focus. You need the component of attaching subjective reward. You need to make errors, all this stuff. And a lot of people find it difficult to just get into the overall state to access those things. So now there's a series of gates that people are having a hard time accessing. They're too tired and they can't focus, for instance. Well, here's the beauty of it. If you are too alert, meaning you're too, anxious, and you want to calm down in order to learn better, there are things that you can do. The two that I've spoken about previously on various podcasts, and I'll just review them really quickly, are the double inhale exhale. So inhaling twice through the nose and exhaling once through the mouth. This is not some yogic trick or some hack. This is what's called a physiological sigh. It offloads carbon dioxide from the lungs. It has a number of different effects. These were described in textbooks and dating back to the 30s, and a number of laboratories have explored the neural circuitry underlying these so-called physiological sighs. That will calm you down faster than anything else that I'm aware of. The other thing is starting to remove your tunnel vision. When you use tunnel vision, you're very focused. That epinephrine is released by dilating your field of gaze, so-called PAM. Great. So now you can start to sort of move up and down this level of autonomic arousal. The key is you want to be in a state of arousal that's ideally matched to the thing that you're trying to perform or learn. So if I'm really anxious and I can't even pick up the basketball, or I feel like I'm shaking, or my muscles are too tight, I don't have that kind of looseness. Now, when I move like that, it almost makes it look like I could throw a free throw, but I miss 95% of the time, unless the basket is very, very low and I place it indirectly. But I guess that's not a free throw, is it? In any case, the point being that you want to be in a state of alertness but calm, and so you need to have ways to calm yourself down when you're too amped up. But the other side of limbic friction is important too. If you are too tired and you can't focus, well, then it's going to be impossible to even get to the starting line, so to speak, for engaging in neuroplasticity through incremental learning, etc. So in that case, there are other methods that you can do to wake yourself up. The best thing you should do is get a good night's sleep, but that's not always possible, or use a NSDR. But if you've already done those things, or you're simply exhausted for whatever other reason, then there are other things that I often get asked about, like, sure, a cup of coffee or superoxygenation breathing, which means inhaling more than exhaling on average in a breathing bout. These are, now we're sort of getting toward the realm of like how you could trick your nervous system into waking up. And if you bring more oxygen in by making your inhales deeper and longer, you will become more alert. You'll start to actually deploy norepinephrine if you breathe very fast. Now, there's another aspect to learning, I think it's only fair to mention, which is that we can all learn very easily when there's something very bad happens to us. And I don't wish this on anyone, but it is the case that if something really terrible happens, that we will have a lifetime memory for that event. The reason why negative experiences can be wired into us so quickly is because our nervous system's main job is to keep us safe. But at a deeper level, it's because negative experiences cue us to the fact that whatever's happening that's really bad is very different than the other things that tend to happen before. So most of our experience doesn't remap us, but those negative experiences deploy high levels of norepinephrine, high levels of acetylcholine, and really make so that whatever it is that we experience in that bad episode is essentially queued up, and so we're on the lookout for it. And this has a number of negative effects, but in terms of psychological and emotional effects, but it is really a process designed to keep us safe. The other ways in which we can learn more quickly, besides just making errors, is when something really surprises us. And if we're positively surprised by something, or we are just flooded with this molecule dopamine, then there's a great opportunity for plasticity. Dopamine is a molecule that's almost always associated with pleasure and with the accomplishment of a particular goal, but it's really also a molecule of motivation. It's a molecule that is released inside of us when we think we're on the right path. And it does have a capacity to increase neuroplasticity, motivation, etc. It's released in response to a number of natural behaviors just that help with the progression of ours and other species. Things like food, sex, in some sense, social connection, although that's more serotonin. And serotonin doesn't have the same effects on plasticity, quite the same. We'll talk about a few later. But dopamine is when we think we're on the right path toward an external goal. A little bit is released, and it tends to give us more motivation toward that goal. I think everyone could stand to enhance the rate of learning by doing the following. Learn to attach dopamine in a subjective way to this process of making errors, because that's really combining two modes of plasticity in ways that together can accelerate the plasticity. So earlier I talked about making errors and having a focused bout of learning that includes making a lot of errors inside of that learning bout. That is going to be frustrating, but the frustration itself is the cue, and epinephrine will be very high under those conditions. But if you can just subjectively associate that experience with something good and that you want to continue down that path as opposed to quitting when you hit the point of frustration, well, then you now start to create a synergy between the dopamine that's released when we subjectively think something is good or tell ourselves something is good, and that situation of making failures. In other words, making failures, failing repetitively, provided we're engaged in a very specific set of behaviors when we do it, as well as telling ourselves that those failures are good for learning and good for us, creates an outsized effect on the rate of plasticity. It accelerates plasticity. Now, some of you might be asking, and I get asked a lot, well, how do I get dopamine to be released? And can I just tell myself that something is good when it's bad? Well, actually, yes. Believe it or not. The thing about dopamine is it's highly subjective. What's funny to one person is not necessarily funny to the next. So it has to have some sense of authenticity for you. But if you really want to be learning the thing that you're trying to learn, that should be reason enough to tell yourself, well, I'm frustrated, but the frustration is the source of accelerated learning. Dopamine is one of these incredible molecules that both can be released according to things that are hardwired in us to release dopamine. Again, things like food, sex, warmth when we're cold, cool environments when we're too warm. It's that kind of pleasure molecule overall, but it's also highly subjective what releases dopamine in one person versus the next. So everyone releases dopamine in response to those very basic kind of behaviors and activities, but dopamine is also released according to what we subjectively believe is good for us. And that's what's so powerful about it. When you put headphones in your ears, it has this incredible effect of making the sounds like they come from inside your head, not from out in the room. And now that might seem like kind of a duh, but that's actually really amazing, right? Your brain assumes that the sounds are coming from inside your head as opposed from the environment that you're in the moment you put headphones in. So if you're listening to an audiobook, or maybe you're listening to this podcast with headphones, that's very different than when you're listening to something out in the room and there are other sound waves, especially if you use these noise cancellation headphones. So if you're going to use white noise to enhance studying or learning of any kind, and this also could be for skill learning, motor skill learning while you're exercising, my suggestion would be that if you're using headphones to keep it quite low, right? This is an effect on the midbrain dopamine neurons that's a background effect of raising the baseline of dopamine release. The way that dopamine neurons fires, they're always firing. Yours are firing right now, so are mine. When something exciting happens, they fire a lot. And when something disappointing happens, that firing, the release of dopamine goes down below baseline. What you're talking about here is raising your overall levels of attention and motivation, which translate to better learning, by just tickling those neurons a little bit, raising the baseline firing. Okay, so you're not turning up the white noise to the point where you're feeling amazing. This isn't like turning on your favorite song. This is actually the opposite. This is about getting that baseline up just a bit. Okay, so I recommend turning the volume up just a bit so that you can focus entirely on the task that you're trying to do. And of course, you've turned on white noise, so your attention might drift to that for a moment. Is it too loud? Is it too soft? If you can disappear into the work so to speak, if your attention can disappear into the work, then that's probably sufficiently quiet. So the first gate is to arrive at learning at the appropriate level of autonomic arousal. Clear and focused is best, but don't obsess over being right there. It's okay to be a little anxious or a little bit tired. Then you want to make errors. We talked about that. And this vestibular motor sensory relationship is absolutely key if you want to get heightened or accelerated plasticity. And we talked about another feature, which is setting a contingency. If there's a reason, an important reason for you to actually learn, even if you're making failures, the learning will be accelerated. So there's really 4 things that you really need to do for plasticity. So these cathedral effects, I think, can be leveraged toward doing particular types of work best. And again, the lower the ceiling or the lower your visual environment, the more that one tends to do, or I should say, performs detailed analytic work accurately. And the more that one's thinking is oriented towards detailed, sort of correct answer type work. Whereas when the ceiling is higher or there's no ceiling, the more that the brain and the rest of the processing that we call cognitive processing is related to abstract reasoning, brainstorming, and indeed can pull from broader swaths of memory resources. Because really what abstract reasoning is it's taking existing elements and maneuvering them or arranging them into novel ways. So you can think about like notes on a piano, playing a particular song, learning scales. That's very analytic. There's a correct answer that you're trying to arrive at or generate. Whereas writing music or writing poetry or generating new material of any kind involves taking existing elements, right? You're not going to use words that you don't have committed to your memory or that you're not aware of, and arranging them in novel ways. So I think the cathedral effect can be leveraged. And again, you don't need to move into a different home or build a slanted roof and work at one side of the room at one part of the day and the other side of the room at the other. Although, hey, if that's the way you want to swing it, that's great. Most of us don't have that flexibility. But it's very clear that the height of the ceiling of the visual environment that we're in has a profound effect on the types of cognitive processes that we are able to engage. Uri Treisman is one of the top calculus professors. Here's what he tells his students on the first day of class. Quote, "Everyone in this class will struggle. No matter who you are, questions are going to be flying at you that you cannot answer. And when that happens, you're going to experience stress. And if you don't understand that stress, you'll think it means, oh no, I don't belong here. But in fact, that stress is an indicator that your understanding is deepening. It's not a sign that you're not learning. It's a sign that you are learning."